When we think about the attack on Pearl Harbor, most people immediately picture the bombs, the planes, and the chaos as it unfolded on that quiet Sunday morning. But what's less often discussed is the decision. One seemingly small choice that left the Pacific Fleet sitting ducks, completely exposed and vulnerable. It wasn't the enemy's tactics that doomed the fleet so much as the failure to anticipate the consequences of a single command decision, made weeks, even months, before the first torpedo struck. At the heart of the issue was the positioning of the battleships. Instead of dispersing the fleet across multiple anchorages or at least keeping them at a higher state of readiness, Naval Command chose to concentrate them in Pearl Harbor, moored side by side. This decision, in theory, was meant to make logistics easier and maintenance more efficient. But in practice, it created a nightmare scenario. One well-placed attack could, and eventually did, hit multiple ships at once. Think of it like stacking fragile glassware in one spot and hoping no one knocks the table over. It's a risk that looks minor until the worst-case scenario actually happens. What's fascinating is that this wasn't a reckless oversight born from ignorance. The intelligence available at the time hinted at Japanese aggression. There were intercepted communications, rumors, and reports from the Pacific that suggested Tokyo might be planning something bold. Yet, the warnings were often dismissed as improbable, or the information was slow to reach the officers who could make the critical calls. The decision to leave the fleet concentrated was made within a mindset that underestimated the enemy's capability and overestimated the security of the harbor. There's also a human element that plays into this story. The commanders at the time were balancing multiple priorities: training schedules, fleet readiness, and even political optics. They wanted the fleet to appear strong and capable, ready to respond at a moment's notice, without considering that visibility and convenience could make them an irresistible target. In hindsight, it's easy to judge, but at the time, the risk seemed manageable, and the alternative, spreading out the ships, which would have complicated maintenance and command, felt unnecessarily disruptive. And yet, that single decision created the conditions for a historic disaster. When the Japanese strike came, the concentrated fleet meant that damage was multiplied. Battleships sank side by side. Repair efforts were slowed because resources were overwhelmed. And the sheer scale of destruction shocked the Navy into recognizing how fragile its most powerful symbols could be. The decision to centralize the fleet, intended as a measure of efficiency, ironically became the very thing that allowed one well-planned attack to cripple the Pacific's strongest force. It's a stark reminder that in military history, and in life, sometimes it isn't the enemy who decides the outcome. It's the choices we make that leave us vulnerable. That moment, that single decision, didn't just affect a few ships. It shaped the course of the Pacific War and left an indelible mark on naval strategy for generations. It's the forgotten blunder, the quiet misstep that made a catastrophe inevitable, long before the first bombs fell. While the decision to concentrate the fleet was devastating in itself, what made the attack on Pearl Harbor even more tragic was how many warnings and signs were ignored. In the days leading up to it, intelligence had been gathering, signals intercepted, and even unusual enemy movements spotted, yet for a combination of reasons: bureaucracy, underestimation, and plain human error, these clues never triggered the urgent action that might have prevented disaster. It's hard not to feel a sense of frustration when you realize that the attack wasn't a complete surprise. It was, in many ways, an avoidable catastrophe. In the months before December 7, U.S. intelligence had cracked some Japanese codes, giving glimpses into Tokyo's growing hostility. Analysts noticed unusual communications, troop movements, and logistical preparations that suggested Japan was planning a major operation somewhere in the Pacific. Naval officers and government officials debated the meaning of these signals, but there was no consensus on exactly where or when an attack might occur. Some dismissed the intelligence as speculative, while others feared raising alarms that could cause unnecessary panic or political tension. It was a classic case of underestimating an opponent, assuming that the Japanese could not, or would not, take bold action. Even on the morning of the attack, there were clues that something was off. Patrol planes spotted unusual activity near the harbor entrance, and some radar operators detected incoming aircraft. But the warning signs were misinterpreted, delayed, or simply ignored. In one of the most infamous examples, a radar operator reported a large group of planes approaching from the north, and his report was brushed off as friendly aircraft returning to base. By the time the truth was realized, there was no time to mount an effective defense. It's chilling to think that a different decision, even just a moment's attention to these signals, could have given the fleet a fighting chance. The failures weren't limited to misread intelligence. They extended to communication breakdowns within the military hierarchy. Orders took too long to travel. Reports were filtered through layers of bureaucracy. And crucial information sometimes never reached the commanders who could act. It's a pattern that's repeated throughout history. When warnings exist but the system isn't prepared to respond quickly, even the most obvious threats can slip through unnoticed. Pearl Harbor is one of the starkest examples of that principle in action. What makes this part of the story so haunting is that it wasn't a lack of skill or courage on the part of the men stationed at the harbor. Sailors, pilots, and officers were ready to fight, but they simply weren't given the chance because the signals that could have prompted defensive measures were ignored or underestimated. The consequences were catastrophic. Lives lost, ships destroyed, and a nation stunned into action. This chapter of the Pearl Harbor story reminds us that history is not just shaped by battles, but by the choices we make in the face of warning signs. The disaster was not inevitable. It was made possible by a combination of misjudgment, missed intelligence, and human error. When we look back, it's a painful lesson in vigilance and accountability. A reminder that ignoring the signs, even subtle ones, can turn a crisis into a catastrophe. The aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack is where the full impact of that single fateful decision really comes into focus. The fleet had been caught off guard, and the destruction was staggering. Battleships that had been symbols of American naval power lay broken and burning, their decks twisted, their guns silent. Aircraft that could have defended them were destroyed on the ground, leaving the harbor almost defenseless. But the consequences went far beyond the immediate devastation. The ripple effects of that one decision reshaped the U.S. Navy, military strategy, and even the course of World War II. In the hours and days following the attack, the Navy scrambled to assess the damage and begin recovery. But the scale of destruction made this almost impossible. Repair yards were overwhelmed. Spare parts were in short supply, and experienced personnel had been lost or injured. Ships that might have been operational in weeks or months required years to return to combat readiness. Entire classes of battleships were temporarily sidelined, which forced the Navy to rethink its strategy and rely on other assets, like aircraft carriers, in ways that might not have happened otherwise. In a strange way, the blunder inadvertently accelerated the shift toward carrier-based warfare. But it came at a tremendous cost. Politically and psychologically, the blow was enormous. The nation was stunned, and the attack galvanized public opinion in a way few events in history ever have. The sense of vulnerability and the shock of seeing the fleet destroyed in what was supposed to be a safe harbor motivated a level of mobilization and urgency that changed the course of the war. Military leaders, both in Washington and in the Pacific, were forced to examine how such a failure had occurred and to implement reforms that would prevent anything similar in the future. Radar systems were upgraded, communication chains streamlined, and the importance of intelligence analysis finally received the attention it deserved. The long-term lessons extended beyond military strategy. The attack became a cautionary tale about overconfidence and complacency, about how concentrating resources without considering potential threats can turn strength into weakness. It's a lesson repeated in countless military textbooks and leadership studies today. One decision, made with seemingly reasonable intentions, created a vulnerability that shaped not just a battle, but the way an entire branch of the military approached risk, readiness, and defense planning for generations. Even the survivors of Pearl Harbor carried the weight of that day with them, recounting the horror, the confusion, and the sudden awareness of how fragile human plans can be in the face of calculated enemy action. The tragedy exposed not just technical or tactical shortcomings but human ones. Judgment, communication, and foresight. Every subsequent naval operation, from Midway to Leyte Gulf, carried echoes of Pearl Harbor, with commanders determined never to let a single oversight dictate the fate of the fleet again. In the end, the story of Pearl Harbor is as much about what was lost as it is about what was learned. The fleet eventually recovered. The war eventually turned in America's favor, but the memory of that decision, the one that left an entire fleet vulnerable, remains a stark reminder that even small choices can have monumental consequences. It's a lesson in accountability, strategy, and the haunting power of human error. And it's why Pearl Harbor continues to resonate as a defining moment in naval history.